I think it's quite clear that the way to force onboarding of a CBDC or this type of digital currency system is going to be some sort of crisis, some sort of event. I think the immigration crises, any sort of refugee situation, that's going to be used to push for digital IDs. I think it's just a very easy excuse for them, a way for them to quickly manufacture consent. Because, all these people, we don't know who they are. They could be criminals. They could be anybody. We have to know who everybody is. And it's going to be sold as a way to provide security to the insecurity created by the migrant crisis. So I think there's been growing awareness for some time that there's a lot of bipartisan consensus about most of the policies of the U.S. government, like endless war, for example. And some people refer to it as the uniparty. But people also forget that too. And so what a lot of people call this the two-party model, people refer to it sometimes as the left-right paradigm. But I think not a lot of people truly understand how that paradigm works. If you think about it as the left hand and right hand of the establishment, you'll have one of those hands create a problem intentionally, and then the opposing hand comes in and offers the solution. But the solution was always what the establishment wanted, but it's sold as a solution to a problem created by the other side. So it creates the illusion that the opposing force solved a problem, but in reality the problem was manufactured by one hand of the system, and then the solution was offered by the other hand. The man that claims to have created CBDCs is a man from Barbados named Oliver Gale. He created one of the first, arguably the first CBDC project in the Caribbean, and then went on to have a key role in creating the Nigerian CBDC, the e-Naira. So the way the CBDC in Nigeria was set up is that in order to access the CBDC, you have to have a national identification number, which is the Nigerian digital ID project. So you have to have a digital ID in order to be able to access the Nigerian CBDC. And the way they tried to get people to onboard to the CBD system was by essentially cutting off the vast majority of the cash in circulation in Nigeria. And so despite the fact that they created these conditions to coerce people into using the CBDC, the populace resists. And that suggests that the idea of CBDCs being a tool for financial inclusion, the public doesn't seem to believe that, right? In Nigeria, these people that ostensibly suffer from this identity gap, that suffer from financial exclusion, don't want the financial inclusion that they're being offered by the CBDC. They don't see any real benefit. They see it as a tool of the state. And the state in Nigeria and in other African countries where these sort of systems are being rolled out, the governments have abused these systems to go after journalists or other people and violate human rights and all sorts of things. So it's not a tool for increased human rights. It's not a tool for increased inclusion. It's inherently exclusionary, and it's a surveillance tool. So if Nigeria's tactic of, drastically reducing the amount of cash in circulation didn't work, then I think it's quite clear that the way to force onboarding of a CBDC is going to be some sort of crisis, some sort of event where people will be made an offer they can't refuse, essentially. Whatever that crisis is that creates this situation where people will have, very little choice but to onboard to this new digital currency system, it could manifest in a number of ways, but regardless of how it manifests, what the narrative is going to be is that privacy is dangerous, anonymity is dangerous, specifically financial privacy is dangerous. Those are going to be the narratives that come out of this event, and that's going to be a way to force onboarding both onto digital currency that can be tracked to stop terror financing or things of that nature. And also we have to know who everybody online is, or we have to know who everybody is interacting with these systems. We need digital ID. Okay. It's very much tied up with efforts to regulate the internet. The effort to regulate the internet, specifically in the United States, has been going on for years. Under the Obama administration, they called it the driver's license for the internet. The idea is to have a government-issued ID be necessary for you to access the internet. And in doing so, they know not just what you're posting and saying online, they know what information you're reading online as well. But the difference is, once it's directly connected to a government-issued ID, they could prosecute you for things like publishing misinformation and all of that. And there's actually been pushes from people like former Google CEO Eric Schmidt to punish people who publish alleged disinformation, and that the need, that it's necessary to have IDs connected to social media accounts and to people's internet access as a means of facilitating those kinds of arrests or, law enforcement activity. Well, there's a couple of reasons why I think they'd want to have private banks have like a major role in this digital currency system to come. If there's a private sector entity banking you and managing your money, it's much easier for them to bank you than the federal government. So for example, if the Federal Reserve were to do a direct issue CBDC, it would be harder for them to freeze someone's bank account or debank them in any sort of significant way, as opposed to a private company where you have, for example, precedents where JP Morgan Chase, for example, debanked Dr. Mercola and some of his executives and didn't give any reason as to why. They just said, we can no longer provide you with financial services, no questions asked. That would be very hard to do in the case of a direct issued CBDC. This is something similar to the argument that's been made for social media companies censoring. They say, oh, but they're private companies, so they can restrict speech however they want. But we know now that their restrictions on private speech have been a result of public sector pressure, right? So again, people need to keep in mind that this is a public-private partnership. That's the prevailing model in the United States. The digital dollar in the United States is also going to be a public-private model. You'll have the Fed, the central bank, working with the private banks that own the Fed in the United States. And that will be the partnership between them will be the system. It's not going to be all public. It's not going to be all private. It is a partnership. If the Fed were to do a direct issued CBDC, it would take them a few years to design, experiment, and deploy it. If you're using these existing dollar-pegged stablecoins, those are already here. They're already on blockchains. And a lot of those phases that would take the Fed a few years have already been accomplished if you choose to use those. And if you regulate them so that they have to, for example, keep their reserves at the Fed, then you're able to sort of have the same kind of system, but you don't have to go through the process of creating a direct issued CBDC. China, for example, they already have their CBDC, so the US is behind. So to remain competitive, they say, and have a first mover advantage, we should go with the digital dollars that are already here. So that's dollar-pegged stablecoins. The banks that are involved in this new system, it's very unlikely it's going to be the existing banks we have in the US right now. And that's because just like in 2008 and more recently with the Silicon Valley banking crisis, every time there's a major financial crisis, there seems to be a major bank consolidation wave. And you have Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, saying during the Silicon Valley bank crisis, in front of Congress, that they are essentially only going to rescue systemically important banks, which is a designator that Yellen can just, she essentially decides who's a bank worth saving and who's not. And this is sort of the perpetuation of the too big to fail model that we heard about in 2008. So one indication this system is being rolled out in this way is looking at the people developing the infrastructure and what type of digital currencies they're supporting. So one of the biggest developers right now of CBDCs is this company called R3 that's backed by some of the biggest Wall Street banks in the world. And they were named by Central Banking Magazine as the CBDC Partner of the Year last year. And then they're developing a litany of CBDCs for countries all around the world. But that's just one part of what they do. They have this thing they call a digital currency accelerator. And the three types of digital currencies R3 develops are CBDCs, stable coins, and tokenized deposits or deposit tokens. And some banks in the US have already rolled out deposit tokens. Citigroup, JP Morgan. JP Morgan actually had a research paper out last year about how CBDCs are inferior to deposit tokens and how deposit tokens are better. So Oliver Gale, who defines himself as the founder of CBDCs, has more recently co-founded a company called Fluent Finance. What Fluent Finance is they attempt to create a trustworthy dollar-pegged stablecoin that they call US Plus. And it's sort of framed as an answer to dollar-pegged stablecoins like Tether that have been controversial for having opaque reserves. So the whole thing about US Plus is having trackable reserves in real time and all of this. And so it's an attempt to create a very extremely trustworthy and backed by a consortium of banks, a bank-led US dollar peg stablecoin. So if the inventor of CBDCs is moving into stablecoins, he probably knows that there's something there.
So what first got you interested in this cyber pandemic?
So not that long after the COVID era began and the World Economic Forum started to be looked at, scrutinized more, particularly by independent media, people had noticed the overlap between the World Economic Forum and Event 201, for example, in the COVID crisis. And so during the COVID crisis, people paid a lot of attention when the World Economic Forum launched its cyber polygon simulations that were about cyber attacks. And during that same period of time, you had Klaus Schwab, the best known face of the World Economic Forum, saying that after COVID, there would be some sort of what he called a cyber pandemic that would have consequences that would make COVID's impact on society seem relatively insignificant by comparison. I think the whole idea of a cyber attack is sort of contradictory to a lot of the stuff that was pushed for during the COVID era, where we were pushed increasingly out of the physical world into the digital world. And then the digital world is also under attack from cyber attacks and what have you. So I think ultimately the goal is to use cyber attacks as a means of centralizing control of the digital world.
And based on these simulations, you think it's going to come in the form of a false hacker attack, or who's going to be the villain in this scenario?
Yeah. So one thing that gets overlooked a lot with cyber polygon and some of these other related simulations about coming cyber attacks is that they seem to involve the big banks. And some of them even involve central banks. There's a major theme of banking here, which I think has been unfortunately overlooked. And it sort of implies that one of these cyber attacks of the cyber pandemic will be on the financial system to some degree. So, for example, if you look at Cyber Polygon, it was the WEF, but it was done in partnership with Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, and was one of the opening speakers of it was the Russian prime minister and things like that, which is in direct contrast, for example, to the supposed Russian hacker narrative that's been propagated extensively in U.S. mainstream media. The U.S. government had no problem and no criticism participating in Cyber Polygon, and no criticism of the WEF for co-hosting their cyber simulation cyber attack simulation with the supposed hackers at large that supposedly interfered in the U.S. elections.
They said that they did that?
Well, okay, so in 2016 and 2020, there were a lot of, narratives propagated by U.S. mainstream media about Russian hackers, and none of those mainstream media outlets criticized the WEF for doing their big cyber attack simulation in partnership with the Russian government.
Oh, they did it with the Russian government?
Yeah, Cyber Polygon was the WEF and a subsidiary of Sberbank, Russia's largest privately owned bank, and also the Russian prime minister gave the opening remarks, and it was affiliated to some degree with the Russian government, yeah. So there's been a few entities besides the WEF that have sort of gamed out these cyber attack simulations in a very significant way. One of them is the Financial Services ISAC, or Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which is essentially the biggest private banks in the United States coming together to share information and plan shared responses to potential crises, including a cyber attack on the financial system. And FS-ISAC is affiliated to an extent with the WEF and also with the Carnegie Endowment. And the Carnegie Endowment has similarly charted out potential solutions if and when there is a major cyber attack on the financial system. And they did so in partnership with the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and some of the biggest private banks in the world like JP Morgan Chase. Their proposed solution is to merge banks, banking regulators, and intelligence agencies as far as information sharing and analysis goes. So that's essentially having banks share your private transaction data directly with the CIA or any other U.S. intelligence agency that asks.
Just kind of like a digital fusion center, an updated version of it.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, doing so is inherently unconstitutional. People would not consent to that if it were not for a major crisis that affects the banking sector. Yeah. Oftentimes they try and pilot these solutions before they're actually implemented. And if there isn't sufficient onboarding or uptake by the public, invariably an event comes along that creates fear and panic among the public to a very significant degree, and they begin clamoring for solutions to this problem that's causing the fear and panic. And the solution is often something that's been tested or pitched years prior. One example of this is, the Obama administration tried to make a driver's license for the internet, directly link your government issued ID to your online activity. And now we're seeing a push to do the same under the guise of stopping misinformation or stopping cybercrime and things like that. It's mainly coming from US, UK, and Israeli intelligence and the big banks through entities like the World Economic Forum's Partnership Against Cybercrime, for example.
You basically think that that's going to be, this could be the great taking catalyst, or you just see a series of events that'll erode people's rights, or what?
The cyber attack seems like a very possible scenario because it's a way for the banks to absolve themselves of any role in a financial crisis. It's an easy way to consolidate banks so that only systemically important ones survive the hack. And it could also potentially be a very effective means of onboarding people onto this new digital currency paradigm. So, for example, let's say this cyber attack on the banks takes place, and they say, well, the existing money in your account has disappeared. The hackers took it, but we can return to you the exact same amount of money you had, but it won't be in the dollars you had before. It will be in USDC or this dollar-backed stablecoin, or it will be this token. So you can get an equivalent amount of money back, right, from the money that was stolen from you, but it has to be this new money. It has to be part of this new system. There's the potential here for people to steal money from you and then essentially give it back to you, but with new conditions and with a new social contract.
Yeah.
You voluntarily accepted this new system and voluntarily onboarded to this new paradigm, but it's a coercion to an extreme degree. All of your money was stolen, right? And now you can only get it back if you take it in the form of the digital dollars that we approve of, or the CBDC, depending on where you are, Mm-hmm. So the head of DHS, Alexander Mayorkas, has said on record that the next big threat to Americans is a cybersecurity event that he called killware. And killware certainly sounds very scary, but if you read the existing definition of it, it refers to cyber attacks on essential infrastructure that has the potential to kill people. So it doesn't necessarily kill people like in the name, but it attacks things like water systems, the power grid, essential infrastructure that people rely on every day. This company called Cybereason in 2020 actually simulated a massive killware attack that was targeting a US presidential election. And the way they conducted this killware simulation, which they did with DHS and some US law enforcement agencies, was to get the US presidential election canceled and martial law declared. So they basically, through that simulation, established what types of hacks could succeed in achieving the declaration of martial law and the cancellation of a U.S. presidential election, which is pretty extreme.
So
why are they doing that?
Why?
I don't know. Why does an intelligence-linked company want to simulate with DHS and law enforcement a series of hacks that disrupt national infrastructure during a U.S. presidential election and martial law is declared? Well, if you look at all of this through the lens of risk management, from the elite's perspective, let's take the words of Larry Fink, for example, of BlackRock, who's been obsessed with risk management his whole career. He has a quote, he's on video, saying that the markets do not like democracy. Democracy is messy. They like totalitarian governments because the risk is low. Elon Musk is one of these figures that's trying to sort of position himself as a free speech champion, and one of these figures that's on the populist right. But in reality, a lot of the policies that Elon Musk promotes, like carbon taxes, for example, have traditionally been policies promoted like the World Economic Forum and entities like this that are seen as being globalist and not populist in nature. People forget that Elon Musk is someone whose business has depended to a large degree on government subsidies, and currently a lot of his companies either depend on mass adoption of electric vehicles via policies linked to the Sustainable Development Goals to phase out fossil fuel vehicles, or they are contractors for the Pentagon and intelligence, like SpaceX.
So you're saying the guy looks like a front, or?
Well, I think there's a conflict of interest with Elon Musk. So, for example, take his recent ownership of Twitter, now called X. The Pentagon has spent the better part of the last decade developing very sophisticated tools to manipulate social media, including bots and other techniques that, per the Air Force in one of their contracts, said was aimed at controlling people with social media like we control drones. Do you think that Elon Musk, as a Pentagon and intelligence contractor, would restrict the Pentagon's use of those tools they spent millions of dollars in over a decade developing? I don't think so. I think we're being pushed towards essentially the same policies, but by a different group of quote-unquote leaders who are trying to frame themselves as the opposite side of the political divide because the existing side that was pushing those they were using sort of more like left-leaning political rhetoric. And so because they got pushback, they're trying to sell those same policies in a different wrapper that's sort of cloaked in this rhetoric of populism and right-leaning politics. I think there's essentially a consensus that some other very significant financial crisis is in the cards for the next several years. And if you are the big banks and you know that's going to happen, you probably want to avoid a scenario like what happened in 2008, where the public knew that you were the source of the malfeasance and the economic problems, which of course spawned movements like Occupy Wall Street. If you want to avoid that, what is the best way to absolve yourself of any sort of blame for mismanaging or losing people's money? If you can say that hackers took it, then you're totally absolved, and whoever the hackers are the ones to blame. And U.S. intelligence, or really any intelligence agency today, can frame anyone they want for a cyber attack. We know this from one of the last WikiLeaks releases called Vault 7, where it revealed that among the CIA's hacking tools were the ability to place the fingerprints of adversary states, or really any group they wanted, into hacks that were actually conducted by the CIA itself. Basically a tool to create cyber false flags for any purpose. And the current CIA director is the person that was in charge of the Carnegie Endowment when they created these papers with the biggest private banks and central banks in the world about a cyber attack on the financial system, and how that would push for a merging of data sharing between banks and the CIA and intelligence.
You spend a lot of your time thinking about these crazy projects. Like, how would you summarize this sort of incessant obsession with controlling people and things, and that these guys have?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons they want this new system that ultimately amounts to a control system is because they see it as the ultimate form of risk management. They essentially want to move to a system that's not unlike the feudal system that existed in medieval Europe. You have, a privileged, untouchable upper class and a low class of serfs. But if you implement a system this way with the technology they're using and all of that, you don't have to worry about peasant rebellions. You can manage the risk of the underclass. So you surveil them constantly. You can turn their money on and off. You can turn their access to services and really anything else on and off as well under the digital ID functionality. It's a way to keep people in line in a way that didn't exist in feudal Europe and under that model. But they're clearly moving to that model, and it's interesting because the UN essentially admits that. They talk about the acceleration of the adoption of all these of all this digital infrastructure is exacerbating the wealth gap and making the billionaires even more wealthy. But the billionaires and the bankers are the people that are designing all these UN policies. People, like Mark Carney, Mike Bloomberg, Bill Gates. All of these guys are the ones influencing these policies more than anyone. They admit that they're exacerbating the wealth gap, but we're full steam ahead on on these policies anyway. So, I mean, they're obviously going to keep exacerbating it. And a lot of those guys that are designing and maintaining the technology or deciding what it does are going to be in a very different class than the rest of us who are, having this system imposed upon us. We're not the ones designing it. We don't have a stake in the stakeholder capitalism model. We're the policy subjects, not the policy makers. We don't have any influence on these policies. The people that do have that influence are oligarchs and bankers and, the elite, essentially. They want to give the illusion that it's a decentralized system, that you're in control of your data, that you have power. But, if you look at how the infrastructure is set up, those are really just marketing. It's marketing, it's talking points. It's not how these things actually are when they're implemented in practice. And the way they're creating the infrastructure is to create centralized data depositories, centralized policy-making bodies, things like that. But they want to give the public the illusion that they're being implemented in essentially the complete opposite way.